We are recording this podcast on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening.
Hello, and welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favorite books. I'm Priscilla, and today I'm flying solo as your host, so hopefully nothing breaks today. I'm not alone in this episode though, because today we have an interview with Sarah Sasson, author of Tidelines. Sarah Sasson is an Australian physician-writer living on Gadigal land in Sydney. She completed her studies at University of New South Wales and Sydney University and has spent time living overseas in Chicago, Singapore, Montreal, Hanoi, and Oxford. Sarah's poetry, short stories, and nonfiction have been published in Australia, the United Kingdom, and USA. Sarah's debut literary fiction novel, Tidelines, was shortlisted for the Farina House Publisher Introduction Program and longlisted for the Queensland Writers' Centre Publishable Program. Tidelines is published by Affirm Press in 2024. And let me tell you a little bit about Tidelines. It's Sydney in the early 2000s, and Grub is spending the summer with her universally adored older brother, Elijah, and his magnetic but troubled best friend, Sid. Their days are filled with surfing, swimming, and hanging out. Life couldn't be better. But years later, Elijah disappears and Grub's family unravels. At first, Grub blames Sid. He was the one who derailed Elijah from a bright future in the arts. But as Grub looks back at those dreamy summer days, the sanctuary of her certainty crumbles. Was Sid really responsible for her brother's disappearance? Was anyone? Tidelines is a tender, coming-of-age novel about growing up in the face of unimaginable loss. It examines the stories we subconsciously write for ourselves and what remains later when we have the courage to tear them apart. Thank you to Affirm Press for linking us together. And before we get started on our interview, here are our usual disclaimers. We are trained psychologists, but this podcast should not be taken as direct therapeutic advice. Please consult a professional for more specific and tailored advice. The first half of this interview is spoiler-free, but the second half contains some spoilers for Tidelines as we dig into the mental health content and what happens in the second half of the book. Here are some content notes. Today, we are talking about topics such as grief and loss, addiction and substance use, burnout, and trauma. And now, let's get started with our interview with Sarah Sasson. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you again for taking the time to do this interview with me. Congratulations on the release of your debut novel, Tidelines. That's really exciting. How has it all been?
Thanks, Priscilla. Yeah, really great to be here. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's been a big week. The book came out on Tuesday. So, it's been really exciting to see the novel start appearing on shelves in local bookstores and, friends messaging me with pictures of it. So, feels like the end of a very long road and the start of another.
That would be, I can imagine, quite a mixed bag of relief, but also anticipation about seeing what people's reactions would be to the book.
Exactly. So the first few days everyone's buying it, and then you're sort of sitting at home drumming your fingers, waiting for people to sort of finish reading it. So
Yeah, wonderful. So your biography states that in addition to being a writer, you work as a clinician and a scientist. How do you balance it all, not just in terms of the time demands, but also the mental demands of your jobs?
It's a good question. I guess some days better than others, but I always had really broad interests. So in high school, my favorite subjects were English and biology, and I didn't have like really definitive career pathway, but I feel like the whole time I've been trying to balance sort of the humanities with my more sort of analytical, quantitative side. At the moment I'm just very interested in medicine obviously, and science, but also writing. So my week is really split between a job at a large public hospital in Sydney, and a university where I do medical research. Really my writing has happened, in the evenings when my children are asleep and on the weekends. And every day is a little bit different. I actually find that really rewarding.
Yeah, wonderful. That's totally impressive. I'm always impressed by people who can balance all a full-time job and writing as well. 'Cause I used to want to be a writer, and then a full-time job happens. Haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah, I would also say it took me a very long time
Mm,
to write the book, and yeah, I have a lot of these conversations now with people who want to write. But
yeah.
I did very much chip away at the early drafts of Tidelines over many years. So I would
Mm,
also say you don't have to pull out a novel in a year,
yeah.
but yeah, I did chip away at those first drafts over many years, just a little bit at a time. And
Mm.
and there's many winding roads to putting a book out, so it can be very slow work, but I think yeah, equally as rewarding.
Yeah, great. Speaking of balancing humanities with the science side of things, in a previous interview, you said that medicine and literature are both ultimately concerned with the human condition. Would you mind speaking more on this?
So I guess long before I became a doctor, so I became a doctor sort of in my late 20s. But yeah, I would consider myself, a reader and a writer long before that. So I was always had my nose in a book, and I always wrote, a lot largely for myself, to sort of make sense of the world. So I think by the time I came to study medicine, um, those parts of myself were very developed. And I remember when I found out I got into the graduate medicine degree, one of the first things I did was I sought out literature, like medical humanities literature and other books about caregiving and the patient doctor relationship. That's the way I went into medicine, sort of
Mhm.
with a strong grounding in those sort of humanistic elements. But as a physician, yeah, that's very much a part of my work, is, face to face with patients. And, in the first step of being with a patient is really taking history and talking to them. That's a very
Mhm.
humanistic
Yeah.
humanities kind of process. So for me, yeah, there are common threads there. I'm very interested in, people and their stories. And, as I often say, medicine is full of stories.
Yeah.
And it's also very, because when you start as a junior doctor, you work very long shifts and you come home and then you turn on the TV and it's actually full of medical dramas.
Yeah.
That shows that popular culture fascination with the medical world is really because it's full of interesting stories and, the human condition and
Yeah.
conflict and drama, and that's all very true to life.
Yeah, absolutely. That is how I imagine Grey's Anatomy has reached 13 seasons or something like that now. How do you think writing has influenced your work as a physician?
Yeah, I'm not so, apart from
Mm,
that, it's just sort of, I definitely don't approach medicine as a hard
yeah.
science
Hmm.
alone. I think there's just those humanistic qualities. I think the other commonality is really empathy. So I think doctors and writers share often are people with a great capacity to empathize with other people. I think to write a novel and to have readers come along with you and suspend their own reality, you
Mm,
have to be able to tap into understanding other human beings, and how emotion works. And similarly, when you're a caregiver, empathy
mm,
plays a huge role in developing that therapeutic relationship. So I also think that's a
yeah.
common thread. So I think writers often have empathy and develop it, and so I probably brought that into medicine as well. And
Yeah.
I guess on the flip side, how has medicine influenced my writing? Well, I'm still very interested in the medical humanities, so I'm
Yeah.
very, no matter what story I'm writing, I always seem to find the edges that interface with
Yeah.
medicine. And I think it's because I've spent so much of my working life, thinking about cells and molecules and disease processes and how that changes a person's lived experience. So I can't seem to get away from it. So
Yeah.
yeah, I suspect a lot of my writing will be on that medical humanities interface.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like then your writing is that Venn diagram between your two great passions. So, which is, it's wonderful to find a niche sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully I can just find that sweet spot in the Venn diagram.
Absolutely. Do you ever think about balancing your writer persona or brand, I suppose, as we would call it these days, with your professional image as a clinician?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think for a long time, as I said, I really wrote for myself to process and understand the world better. And occasionally I would send things off for publication or competition, but it never really impacted my working life at the hospital. And a lot of people didn't know I wrote. So that's been really interesting. I kind of kept my two worlds
Yeah.
separate. So the very interesting thing about releasing a debut novel is the cat's out of the bag, and
Yeah.
colleagues for the very first time know now that I write. So that's been a little bit interesting and a little bit stressful for me, but not in a bad way. I just feel like my
Yeah.
worlds are colliding. I am a little bit conscious of the fact that I'm still seeing patients, and that sort of doctor caregiving role is, a huge amount of trust is put in you as a physician. And then, on the other hand, I'm writing fiction. So that's interesting. And I think sometimes I probably, sort of temper myself, or I probably take less risks in my fiction because of the way that maybe I'll be
Yeah.
perceived, in my professional life. Yeah, it's hard to write really risque or avant-garde things, when you're in this very public sphere. But apart from that though, it's overwhelmingly been a positive response from my colleagues.
Yeah.
But it has been funny that it's all out in the open now.
Yeah, that's good. I think that sounds a lot when I fantasize about publishing a novel. That's kind of my thought process as well. Like, what would happen if a client come in and say,
Mm.
I've read your book? And,
Yeah.
what would that be like? Even with this podcast, sometimes I'm like, oh, what would happen if the two kind of collides and someone, my colleague knows about this, but what if a client finds out and, things like that. I think it's always interesting to think about the balance of the different parts of ourselves, I suppose.
It is. Yeah, and I don't think, I think we probably overthink it, or I probably
Yeah.
do, but I often look at other writers on, in social media or the lay press, and, artists play a really important role in challenging social norms and driving political debate. And, often they're right on the edge of cultural change, and they can be quite disruptive figures in, in both positive and negative way. But, physicians in public hospitals, we're bound by guidelines. We can't really speak to the media without prior approval. So that's quite interesting. I can't just speak for myself at all times. I do have responsibilities to the organizations that I work with. So, that's sort of when I often think about it, is sometimes like, oh, wow, look at those writers. They're really, they're just really out there putting their thoughts into the world, which is wonderful. But I always have to have that voice in my head, like, you got to go to clinic on Monday.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. Sounds like you're doing a good job maintaining that balance. Yeah. All right, let's dive into Tidelines. Since we are in the first section of this interview, we'll keep it non-spoilery. So the main character in Tidelines is referred to as Grub, or Dr. Donahue, but her actual given name is never actually mentioned in the book, unless I've missed it somehow. No? Okay. What prompted that decision not to give her a given name?
Yeah, great question. And a few people ask me, they're like, did I miss it? No, so I'm a huge Margaret Atwood fan. And when I was young, I think I was 20, I went over to Montreal in Canada to study at McGill University, and I studied Canadian literature. And one of the books we studied was I think it's her second book, called Surfacing, a beautiful novel, which I would highly recommend. And I read the whole book of Surfacing and loved it, and then went to lectures, and then I realized that she was an unnamed narrator, and it kind of blew my mind. I'd never read a book with an unnamed narrator before, and I just couldn't believe she'd gotten away with it. I thought it was amazing. So it's a little bit of a riff on Atwood's Surfacing. For most of the book, the main character is known as Grub, which is a family nickname, and then towards the end, through her own ambition and hard work, she graduates from medical school and becomes Dr. Donahue. So, I just kind of like that development of, she starts the book with a name given to her by her family, but she finishes, she's created her own name through her own choices. So, you definitely haven't missed it. I didn't put any other names in there, but, it was sort of a tribute to another writer, essentially.
I love that. It's like it's a marker of that transition in her growing up from being this little girl to her own woman. And I can see how that is tied to what happens with Elijah as well and his impact on Grub. Speaking of which, Tidelines tracks the unraveling, so to speak, of Grub's brother Elijah, who started out as the golden child, so to speak, as the one who is full of potential. One contributing factor to Elijah's difficulties is addiction. What are some of your considerations when it comes to portraying his substance dependence and how it impacts his relationship with Grub?
I should start out by saying, so before I wrote this novel, I'd only ever written poetry. So I didn't have a clear and finished vision of how the novel would finish. But I did know I was writing a coming of age novel, and I did know I was writing about ambiguous loss. So in the first drafts of the novel, Elijah disappears in the third act, and we don't really, we initially don't find out what happened to him. And then I realized that was very unsatisfying for the reader. And so we're sort of working backwards from that, like, well, what could be the factors at play that would cause a young man like Elijah to disappear? And then as we spoke earlier, I'm trained as a physician, so I spent a lot of time in public hospitals, but I did spend a few months in a rehabilitation centre for mental health and addiction and trauma. And I think through some of my life experiences that came into the novel about, how that might lead someone to disappear. And I just find it interesting. Addiction is quite interesting. Often in the book, I'm playing with that idea too about genes versus environment. So, there's obviously genetic factors, inherited factors probably contributing to addiction, but then, the environment we're in also plays a hand, and that sort of, thread in Tidelines as well. So that was some of the thoughts going through my mind. And then obviously their relationship is one of the central relationships of the novel. And it's really a book about sibling love, but then how that love, is challenged and put through the ringer a bit by the addiction and health issues that Elijah has.
Yeah, and I feel that definitely comes through later as I suppose Elijah becomes more of the dependent one. I don't know if that's the right word, but when they were growing up, it seems like Elijah was forging ahead and Grub was following, and then the tables turn later in life, and you can see how that role reversal impact or have a strain on their love for each other as well. So I thought that was fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so growing up, there's a 3 years age gap. It's also interesting to think about when the book opens when Grub's 14, Elijah's 17, and I think when you're younger, 3 years is huge, but then, as you go into adulthood, really, 5 and 10 years doesn't even seem like that big a deal in like relationships or friendships. But definitely, I was writing into that reversal of, she I think she says at one stage in the novel, for the first time I felt older than him, because as you said, his life is starting to unravel, and he's starting to lean on her rather than the other way around.
Yeah. You mentioned that you knew going in that you were writing about ambiguous loss, and that really stood out in the book as well, particularly, and I don't think this is a spoiler because it's in the blurb, that Elijah disappears in the course of the novel. Can you talk about your considerations when approaching writing ambiguous loss?
Yeah, I was really fascinated that you picked up on that with the question, because if I trace back to the very origins of this novel, so the novel and the characters are all fictional, but it was written at a time when I was going through a lot of personal grief as well. And so if I had to trace back the kernel of the novel, so I lost my dad's mother, my nana, who I was very close to. She died, she was 85 and she'd lived an amazing life and was really quite fit and healthy to the end. But she died very suddenly. And while I was grieving her, there were a couple of very high profile cases of missing children, both here and overseas, that were being televised a lot at the same time. And it was really sitting in my own grief and watching. And I was like, my grief is so heavy, and yet my loved one was 85 and had a good life, and we know exactly what happened to her and she didn't really suffer. And it was really that empathy with these cases that were very high profile of these missing children. And really that was the kernel of Tidelines, because I just thought, how do these families cope and move forward and live with that ambiguous loss of losing their child, and actually not knowing what happened to them. So those are the two things I knew: coming of age and writing about ambiguous loss. As I said, because of the narrative arc in a book, I didn't think it was fair to the readers to leave it completely open at the end. I think that would have been a satisfying read. So but that's really in solving those sort of writing issues was how the rest of Tidelines sort of came to be.
There are more that I would love to talk about in regards to the book's themes, but that would be spoilery. So before we move on to the spoiler questions, do you have any author or book recommendations to share with our listeners?
Yes, definitely. So, I'm very aware with Tidelines that I'm writing from the point of view of a sibling, of someone with mental health issues. So I think really great companion pieces would be sort of first person or own voices accounts of people actually living with mental health challenges. So two books that I read sort of quite recently, Anna Spargo Ryan's A Kind of Magic she's a stunningly beautiful writer, and really it's such a personal story, but I loved that book. And more recently, Ros Bellamy's Mood, again, a memoir, Australian memoir about living with, it's actually, part of it is getting the diagnosis. So Ros really beautifully writes about how difficult it is sometimes to link symptomology and feelings with finding the right caregiver who can make the right diagnosis. They sort of bounce around between clinicians and diagnoses as well, but it's really powerfully portrayed. More from overseas novelists, after I wrote Tidelines, I read Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Gyasi, and that's really, it's a stunning novel, but it's very interesting. It's sort of in dialogue a little bit with Tidelines. It's written in America during the opioid epidemic. So again, there's a brother-sister relationship, but it's more heavily centered around the opioid epidemic, but there are some interesting comparisons with Tidelines. And I recently discovered the work of Patricia Lockwood, who wrote No One Is Talking About This and Free Study, and both excellent books.
Yeah, wonderful. Those are great recommendations. We'll include them in our show notes as well so that our listeners can find them. All right, let's move on to the next section of this interview. If you haven't read Tidelines to the end, please come back to this later because we will be talking in more depth about the plots and some of the themes as well. I'd love to talk a bit more about Grub. So she studies medicine, but she steps away from the practice of medicine due to burnout and finding it quite confronting. Can you talk a bit about why research is better for her than medical practice, at least at this stage of her life?
Yeah, so I think in high school, Grubb recognises, I think she is a quite empathetic person, and she says quite explicitly she sort of wants to use her career to sort of help other people, and thinks that means studying medicine, but finds the hospital work very confronting. And so, I think begins her internship, but then sort of I think suffers quite a lot of vicarious trauma through that work, and ultimately has kind of a breakdown, and then eventually there's an ad in a paper talking about doing PhDs in medical research, and that's a way for her to use her intellect and skills, still helping people and the field of medicine, but in a way that's less frontline every day. So she moves into the lab. And, I guess I was very lucky, and I was in a big, well-supported hospital for my internship and felt very well prepared and quite like hospital medicine. But the whole way through my training, there were definitely moments where I would catch myself and go, wow, this is a lot.
Yeah.
And I can totally see why some people don't enjoy this and why some people walk away. And actually, my partner is a doctor as well. And I remember he graduated the year above me, and we were so excited when he first stepped into the hospital. And after his first day, I was sort of like jumping around saying, well, how was it? And the senior doctor that he was working with, that had decided to leave medicine, and for similar reasons, actually, just saying, it was all getting too much, and he was finding just the amount of trauma that he was being exposed to, and sort of other people's pain and suffering, finding it too much. So that's part of Grub's story. And so I sort of wrote it, in a part, it's sort of the narrative drive. But as I was editing it, I finished the book long before COVID, but it was interesting how COVID impacted the healthcare workforce. And I was at the hospital through COVID, but we're seeing huge amount of burnout, lots of people leaving, and then even the people who are sticking around, there's just a lot of fatigue and exhaustion. It's a very tired work at the moment. So it sort of held true as I was writing and editing. That issue of Dr. Burnout, I think, has only become more relevant, not less.
You mentioned vicarious trauma, and I feel like that's such an important thing for anyone going into the health or caring profession needs to know about. And I've seen so many headlines, I feel, about young doctors struggling with their mental health at the start of their practice. If we have any future medical professionals listening to this episode, what ideas or suggestions would you give them about looking after their own mental health? You're shaking your head.
It's so hard. It's so hard. And I don't, I'm thinking back, and you get a lot of advice as a medical student and a junior doctor about, and make sure to take care of yourself. But really, I can't remember much practical training. We got very good training in Breaking Bad News. We had amazing sessions at Sydney University where I was. Yeah, we had sessions with professional actors and actresses who would come in, and we would role play, giving a difficult diagnosis or explaining someone had passed away. Just that was an amazing experience. So I felt in some areas quite well prepared, but taking care of your own health while you're, working a really demanding job, caring for other people, it's really hard. And I think there's no easy answer, because the answer is going to be very different for everyone, and things that worked, how I take care of myself, would be very different. But the general guidelines is, number one, you have to have your own GP and your own healthcare team. And for some people that also means a psychologist and a psychiatrist, because a lot of healthcare workers obviously have their own mental health that needs to be maintained. I think also for me, and this is sort of linking back to, why I'm holding on to writing, but, staying in touch with those things that bring you joy outside of medicine. And when you're going through specialty training, you have to sacrifice so much because the study demands are so great. So you end up, your social life winds down, you do less of everything that you used to, and it's very easy to let those other things slip away, things like hobbies and interests and sporting teams and musical instruments. And, for me, creative writing, having a creative outlet. But the more I go on, they're not added extras. They become essential. They become essential to going on. So, the advice would be to just really cling to those things in your life that bring you joy, because, you're going to need them. And ultimately, another very powerful thing, when we graduated from medical school, I remember there was a final night and we had a dinner, and a very senior hospital staff member stood up to give a speech. And some of his parting advice was, medicine is a career that will devour you. And it was a very funny thing to say, because I was sitting there going, oh, it's such a happy occasion. And, all of the mood was really elevated. And he really stood up there and said, medicine is a career that will devour you. And I think of that often, because I think he was just trying to warn us by just saying, don't let this become your whole life. Yes, enjoy your job and work hard, and you'll get a lot out of it, but don't let it become your whole life, because, I think it's, as you would know as well as a psychologist, I think you can't let anything become your whole life, and you need balance and perspective from the outside world as well.
Yeah. And I suppose when you go, people who go into these caring professions, you're there because you want to help and look after other people. And sometimes it's so easy to just bring that home and be in that mindset about, what about that person or that person? What else can I do? Or what did I do wrong? I think
Mm.
particularly my parents are both doctors. So growing up, they would be talking about work at the dinner table, and they would say, "Oh, this patient passed away today." And I'll be like, this seems like such a big deal, but they seem to have gotten to a place where that was part of life, I suppose.
I'd love to explore the children of
Yeah.
doctors, and especially two doctors. I think some of them go, "I want to be a doctor," and then the
Yeah.
other half were like, "Not pay me enough
No.
to be a doctor." And, yeah, and it's very funny because, as I mentioned, my partner's a doctor as well, and so we have, because it's hard because we
Yeah.
come home and it's part of our debriefing process too, is to talk
Mhm.
to each other, and obviously often the children are around. But yeah, you realize how it's such a rarefied environment, and we do have to catch ourselves, depending on what company we're in, because normal for us in terms of the conversation, can be very confronting for
Yeah.
yeah, only children, but just other people who aren't exposed to that trauma.
It's unfortunate that Elise isn't here today for this interview, because she and I have taken different paths in terms of, the clinical practice versus the research. So that was part of why I was interested in Grub's journey with that as well. Do you think there will be a time where Grub will go back to practicing medicine, or is research her true love?
Oh, that's interesting. I feel like if Grub had gotten help in the hospital and was supported, I definitely think she had all the attributes to be a very good doctor. So I think she kind of cut her losses very early. So, but the way, yeah, I think she's pretty happy now with the path that she's chosen in research, because she
Yeah.
feels that she's helping people, but also there's a bit of a sense that she quite enjoyed and sort of unveiled a talent there for the kind of research that she was doing, and was getting some good results and some good feedback from her supervisors. So I think she stays. I think she stays on that path of helping people, just a couple of steps away.
Yeah. Yeah, still an important role in helping people as well. The other theme that I wanted to talk about is the immigrant experience, particularly of Rob and Elijah's parents, who have both been affected and displaced by war and conflict. And we still see the impact of that trauma on Grub's grandpa. Later in the book, Grub's friend Saray, is that how you pronounce her name? Yeah. She talks about her parents fleeing Cambodia. Why was it important to you to include these stories in the book?
I think it's very important that national literary canon is reflective of real life. And I think, I have read a lot of Australian fiction in my time. And, there's lots of families in this country who can trace their heritage back to the First Fleet and colonial times. And then excitingly, we're seeing a lot of books, from new migrants and sort of first generation stories, which I think are also excellent. But but there's also a lot of families in between. And I'll just say, I did lean into my own family history a little bit there because, people, I think, often make assumptions about me, but, just based on how I look, that, maybe my family has been in Australia for a long time, but, the sort of genealogy that comes through the book is pretty true. So I think, I'm about third generation Australian on my mum's side, who was Northern Irish. And then my dad had the same immigration story as Rebecca's family. So I just wanted to write into that truth that actually there are multiple generations of Australians in this country. I wanted the book to reflect that. But also, I've spent most of my life living in big cities, and Sydney is a big city with lots of different cultures. And it really excitingly, like, I know so many people and couples where we're now seeing, all these different cultures are coming together and bumping into each other and getting married and having kids. And I just wanted to embrace that complexity and just say, Australian literature isn't just, about, people who arrived on the First Fleet and the very early days and the new migrant stories, that there's actually a complexity there that we should embrace and celebrate of, what an amazing country we have that has welcomed so many waves of immigration, and now we're all bumping up together and living together. neighbors and friends and falling in love with each other. Yeah. And, and I think that's, I just wanted to write that into the novel.
Yeah, I love that. And I love this sort of repeated wisdom around material things don't matter. It's what's in your head that you can carry with you. I feel that resonated with me because that was something my parents would talk about as well. Like, if anything happens, you need to have a good education, because if anything happens, that's what you take with you.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting. So some of those conversations are based on real conversations I had with friends. And I also think it's interesting, so how diverse the migrant stories can be. But yeah, my dad's family, they were displaced. But then later on, I had friends who were Cambodian, and I definitely had those conversations where there was, despite the conflicts being completely different and in totally different countries and unrelated, those themes that come through, you only get to take what you can carry with you, or things that other people can't take away. I think there are echoes around that. And then also we should, just looping back to the vicarious trauma, we should also recognize the trauma people and some migrants are bringing with them, and, and to understand that a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also just popped into my head that there might be some ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief there as well with Grub's Nono, because he's there, but he's not really there anymore. And that could be difficult to deal with.
Yeah. And the other thing I did want to say was I was very aware that, it's 2024 now, and I'm writing about mental health. And, Elijah's journey is really challenging and it's really hard. Part of what I wanted to do with both Grub and Nono was they both have their own kind of challenges that relate to mental health, and I did want to show Grub sort of surviving hers and thriving in her challenge of burnout, and then also Nono, that's a sort of complex combination of, like you said, there's the trauma of displacement, plus there's like memory loss and dementia there as well, with persecutory delusions. But, I did want them as foils to what was happening with Elijah, and just also to acknowledge that, those mental health challenges, there's a range, and there's a range of severity and how it presents and what happens as well.
Yeah, and I suppose the difference between getting help and not, and that cultural shift in terms of how trauma is understood. All very fascinating. There's also a very fascinating character in Tidelines that we haven't spoken about. So I would love to chat about Zed, who is Elijah's best friend in the book. I would like to highlight this line. He was the crystallized amber edges of a wound I couldn't help running my fingers over. This feels to me like the perfect summary of Zed's sort of charm and pull, and this sort of danger that, or almost violence as well, that he possesses. What drew Elijah and Grub to him?
Yeah, it's funny. When I started going through the editing process with the publishing house, one of the comments was like, before she becomes interested in Zed, there's a very nice boy at school called Lucas, and the editor, like, well, I didn't understand, why is she attracted to Zed, when she's got, Lucas is there, and he's, very, upstanding citizen, a very nice boy, and everything like that. And I was like, look, I can't tell you why, but I can tell you it's true of the species. So but he is. I think of him as magnetic. I think in one way he's probably very different. So we see, Grub and Elijah live a fairly comfortable life, very, they've got a close and loving family, and there's no, struggle with money. Both the parents are employed. They live in a, a nice part of the city. And then clearly Zed is sort of transplanted into that world. His childhood, from what we understand, has been a lot rockier. He's living with an aunt. He has a lot less in terms of material things. And there's been issues with his biological parents. So look, I think some of the initial attraction might be, he was different, like, he was someone who was sort of came into their world, and he was a little bit different. I think there's a very I was reading this book. There's a book by Damien Cave called Into the Rip. It's a really fabulous book. He's an American journalist, and he and his family come to live in Australia. And it's all basically about risk taking in childhood and adolescence. And he makes the comment that, generally and stereotypically, young adolescent boys will take more physical risks. So they will drive fast, or they'll experiment more with illicit substances, or they'll jump off high ledges. But girls will take more emotional risks. And when I read that, I'd already written the book, but I was like, maybe that's what's going on here. Like, maybe an emotional risk taking here. She's not going with the safe boy from school, and she's attracted to this. That he's older. He's the brother's friend, and there's definitely an edge to Zed. He's always pushing the envelope a little bit with what they're doing. Things they shouldn't be doing. So there was something exciting, and I think even Grubb said she links that later to sort of he feels a bit like an adrenaline rush, and and that becomes confusing. She mistakes that for a signal that he could be the one. But he's definitely very important character in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's a great foil for Elijah as well, for everything that you explained. But then later in the book, because for a while it seemed like their paths are run parallel, but then there's that line at the end of the book where it said, 2 boys got in over their heads, but only one made it back to shore. Am I mad because it wasn't the one I expected? And I suppose, as a reader, I would expect Elijah to be the one who would make it back. And I'm fascinated because you mentioned before that you wanted to explore gene versus environment and how that interacts in terms of addiction as well. So would you like to talk more about this, and is it even possible to speculate why it was Zed who made it back and not Elijah?
I think one of the points I was exploring between Zed and Elijah's friendship is, so they've got these different backgrounds, and they sort of they go along this pathway where they're taking risks, and then they end up in very different places. So one of the points I wanted to make, I guess, was things like addiction and mental health doesn't really discriminate. Like, it doesn't matter that Elijah, is from a loving home and, a very middle-class family, and, he's got all this support, plus he's got these like amazing talents with music and athleticism. Like, actually, like addiction and mental health can affect anyone. So that was one point I was going to make. I also did want to pay credit to the journey that Zed had been on. I think Grubb kind of calls him a survivalist, but he's had a very challenging childhood, and I think he's learned a little bit along the way to take care of himself, and not necessarily in a bad or selfish way, but just in a way that was necessary. So I think probably through the hard scrap of his childhood, he probably did pick up, he's probably quite a strong person, and maybe navigated that risk. They both faced the same kind of risk, but he was able to get himself out because maybe he was sort of had developed some earlier skills. But when I was working in the rehab center, there were people who'd come in and, say just with alcohol, they would just be like, well, I don't understand. I was drinking the same as all my other friends. And, especially like in the post high school era. And then it's interesting how for some people that can lead to quite a serious issue with addiction. And then other people can just go, oh, okay, I'm going to give up tomorrow. And so I was interested in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoyed that about the book. And one of the things I enjoyed is Grubb's struggle, I suppose, with blame or guilt. We started the book with her essentially ready to accuse Zed of ruining their lives, and then she comes to a place of forgiveness, perhaps, or acceptance. And I find that really fascinating because I think it would have been easy for her to blame Zed for all of it and sort of wipe her hands clean of the whole thing, but she decided not to take that, I guess, that route. So what was the thought process there for you?
Zed, as I said, he was very important, and he really broke the book open for me. So definitely when I started writing the book, I was very interested with temporal association. So I don't know if you come across it in your work, but like if someone if they try a new brand of tomato sauce and then the next day they fall ill with like a condition, when you're taking the history, it's very easy. People always blame the tomato sauce or blame like the new thing that just came into their life because temporally it seems to associate, but actually, they're probably unrelated. So I was toying with that idea that Elijah's life starts to waver at the same summer that Zed comes into their life. So I was toying with that idea of, Grub. That's how Grub associates it. Will everything change when Zed came into our life? And I will admit that when I was writing the very first drafts, Zed bordered on being a very stereotypical character. So he was very much the bad influence friend. He was one having the bad ideas and leading them down the garden path. But through the writing of the novel, actually there was a day where very clearly he looked at me from out of the pages and he just said to me, well, you're just as bad as all the rest of them. And that's when I realized that I was using him as a scapegoat. And then I had to imagine how that summer, the first summer and all the other summers, looked from Zed's point of view. And as soon as I started, like, even though the book is always written from Grub's point of view, I had to honor Zed's journey and story. And as soon as I let that through in the writing, the work became far more interesting. And I think it's a far more nuanced story. But how you finished with your question, I mean, and it's sort of a nice coming of age arc, because I think we see Grub kind of do a little bit of growing up in those 20 minutes that she's sitting in the car, reflecting on what she's do. And that's part of, we're seeing actually just a moment of emotional growth for her.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this conversation. As you can tell, I'm fascinated by a lot of the themes that are in Tidelines, and I've really enjoyed reading it. And I hope that more people will pick it up.
Wonderful. Thanks, Priscilla. Thanks for taking the time. And really interesting discussion. So I really enjoyed talking to you also.
That wraps us up for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you like us, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on novelfeelings.com or on Instagram, Twitter, The Storygraph, and Goodreads via novel_feelings. You can also find my Bookstagram page with books with an extra S at the end. Check out Tidelines as well by Sarah Sasson. It is now out in bookstores everywhere in Australia. Thank you again to Sarah for joining us for this interview. Thank you for listening. See you all next time.